This is Greater LA on KCRW, the show that connects you to the people and places of Southern California. I'm Steve Chiatakis. So here's a question. Can you help solve a crisis and profit from it at the same time? It's a question that comes to mind at this so-called tiny home village in North Hollywood, a relatively new kind of homeless shelter. Now, looking around, you see rows of what look like small sheds, painted different colors. There's 75 of them altogether, but this makeshift campus is only one of nearly a dozen villages like this to pop up all around LA in the past few years. And all of them are supplied by one company, a for-profit startup in Washington state called simply Pallet. Well, Pallet isn't the only company making tiny homes, but they have cornered the market in Los Angeles and in cities all across the country.
From 2019 to 2020, we had 7,000% growth in demand.
That's Pallet founder and CEO Amy King. So what's behind that massive growth? And what does it say about the future of this crisis of the unhoused? KCRW reporter Anna Scott picks up the story from here.
Every business story, in one way or another, is about supply and demand. Demand for safe places to sleep in LA is overwhelming.
You don't feel it until you hear it.
When Steve Mason lost his housing a few years ago, it didn't sink in right away.
When people go, hey, you look like you're homeless, it's like, not really. But the bottom line is, if you have to turn that corner with that cart and figure out where you're going to sleep, it's real.
Mason is one of more than 40,000 people unhoused in the city of LA, and the city doesn't have nearly enough shelter beds for them all. It's easy to see why tiny homes, as they're known, have caught on as a way to boost that supply. They can be assembled in less than an hour almost anywhere. Mason moved into one about a month ago. It is tiny, 8 feet by 8 feet, but offers privacy, AC, and heat, and it stands on a secured, fenced-in campus of sorts with restroom, trailers, meals, and social services, overseen by a nonprofit called Hope of the Valley. Their CEO is Ken Kraft.
It's amazing what happens when you treat people with love and dignity and respect and give them the basic human needs that they deserve.
To Ken and many city officials, the proliferation of tiny homes is a story of supply at last matching the urgency of demand.
This is a long overdue emergency response to a humanitarian crisis.
Others see a different story, starting with the term tiny home.
We refuse to refer to a tool shed as a tiny home.
Pete White is the executive director of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, a Skid Row-based advocacy and community organizing nonprofit.
The thing that's really interesting about the tiny tool shed strategy is that I think many people don't know where it came from.
He's referring to a court case that had a lot to do with fueling the tiny home craze, or let's say tiny shelter for the sake of compromise. In 2020, a group made up of mostly downtown business owners and residents sued the city and county over encampments and conditions on the streets. City officials recently settled and agreed to build thousands of new shelter beds.
We find ourselves now in a place where there has been a backpedaling away from anything akin to permanent housing and moving forward quickly towards shelters.
And that, he argues, is more about sweeping unhoused people off sidewalks and cracking down on street camping to appease housed constituents than it is about solving homelessness.
The only thing that solves this crisis is housing.
City officials like LA Mayor Eric Garcetti say they know permanent housing is what solves homelessness, and they're building that too. But it's slow, and what's in the pipeline isn't even enough to meet the demand. And in the meantime, the situation on the streets is untenable. And this brings us back to the business opportunity. Pallet CEO Amy King says she saw a chance to do well by doing good.
So we wanted to create something that would sort of fill the gap for people so that the streets didn't become a waiting room while people waited for housing to be built.
The company, which employs formerly unhoused people, sells its 8x8 tiny shelters for about $7,000 apiece, mostly to municipalities like LA, who then set them up largely on publicly owned land and hire nonprofits to provide services. Throughout 2020 and 2021, Pallet lobbied the LA Mayor's office, the City Council, and other departments on homelessness policy, and the marketing paid off. Besides becoming the go-to company for manufacturing these shelters in LA, Pallet recently raised $50 $15 million from a half dozen investors to expand its business. King says the investors care as much about mission as the bottom line.
More than a return on investment, they are looking to me for things like, are we getting people into work and getting their wages up? Are we helping them get into permanent housing?
The individuals and funds who invested, King says, are the types who also get behind things like green technology. There is a big difference, though. With green technology, they're banking on a transition to cleaner energy, a solution to a crisis. With tiny shelters, investors are banking on cities building out their shelter systems as homelessness continues to be a massive problem for the foreseeable future.
I will be very happy to celebrate the day that we shut the doors of this shop because our product is no longer needed.
In North Hollywood, Steve Mason says he's grateful for his tiny shelter, but ready to get out of it.
I've been homeless for a long time, and it's my time to move on, to trade one of these gorgeous tiny homes to someone else less fortunate than me and move on.
But because of LA's lack of permanent affordable housing, a typical stay in a tiny shelter can run anywhere from 4 to 12 months. And this waiting room is about to get more crowded. Now that many COVID restrictions have been lifted, some city council districts are starting to require 2 people per 8-foot by 8-foot tiny shelter. For KCRW, I'm Anna Scott.